Age of Fantasy Skirmish. Today's video applies to the entire one-page rules family of games. We're going to drill down and we're going to focus in on this section right here. Most people focus on this. A lot of videos talking about the difference between Havoc Warriors and Dwarves and why which spells are good, which powers are good, how can you stack to make a super army. As far as I'm concerned, that kind of preparation, while interesting, I'm not an army list builder. I'm a gamer. I'm all about the games. And when you sit down to play this game, I guess an argument could be made that this is how you start to play the game. But when I sit down to the table, when I belly up to my opponent, the first thing that we're going to do is roll those D6s to find out, first we set up the terrain, right? Pretty neutral battlefield. In any case, terrain is difficult to talk about. Some units are better at avoiding terrain. Some are better at moving through it. I don't think we need to belabor that. But the first thing to be aware of is, with this game, you have anywhere from 3 to 5 objective markers. And when it comes to placing objective markers, we're going to talk about that first. There's some thinking that needs to go into it. Sometimes the game is won or lost based on where those objectives are placed. Kind of. Objectives and deployment are closely connected. We're going to talk about those two. And it's interesting that they're so closely connected from a strategic standpoint because they are not connected from a rules standpoint. First, you dice off to find out who gets to place the first objective. Then you dice off to find out who gets to deploy first. There's some really interesting things going on in this game design. First of all, when it comes time to place those objective markers, the number of objective markers is critical. It may make a huge difference in your strategy. Where you place those objective markers is also going to be important and is going to depend somewhat on your army and whether or not you think you're going to be the first one to go. But this is where the elegance of the system really comes in. You don't know where your deployment zone is, so you can't place those objective markers in a location that you can be certain of how you're going to approach the game. Or can you? There are some general rules of thumb that you should think about when you start placing objectives. So let's start, as the games themselves do, with the fact that you are going to have anywhere from 3 to 5 objective markers. And there are some interesting aspects to consider when it comes to how many objective markers you have. Although, I don't know how much there is to talk about when you have no control over that. You'll either have 3, 4, or 5. That's all there is to it. I've laid out the edges of the 2 deployment zones, the near zone in yellow, the far zone in red. Bear in mind, this is just an example, so scale doesn't really apply at this point, but moving forward, I am going to quote all of the distances as those listed in the rules. I play at half scale, so when I show you a ruler that is 6 inches, treat this as 12 inches. I may say, see, here's 12 inches. That's because I've doubled this to bring my measurements in compliance with the rules as they are written. So what we have here is a table that is 24 inches across. And when we place our objective markers, we are required by the rules to place these outside of the deployment zones and further than 9 inches away from each other. This is where our first thinky bits have to kick in. Do we want to put all of our objective markers as close as possible to one of the deployment zones? This is an all or nothing, high stakes, high risk gamble because there is a 50-50 chance that you might be deploying on the opposite side of the table. There may be some instances where you're willing to take that risk. If you have a particularly fast-moving army, then the distance doesn't scare you. Go ahead and let them seize these. In fact, it may even be better to force your opponent to stop and seize these objective markers and squat on them, because it allows you to move through terrain pieces that might otherwise be a problem for you. On the other hand, if you have a very slow army, this is also a high-stakes gamble. This could work out really well. If you have the dwarves, who are very slow but are very sticky, what with their shield wall and whatnot, and we'll just use this as an example, +1 defense rolls against hits that are not from spells, go ahead, you're the dwarf. And some people might say this would be suicidal for the dwarves. If they have to deploy over on the red line, then that's going to be a problem for them because they are so slow. But bear in mind, with this gap of 24 inches, they don't have to move the full 24 inches to get into contact with these objective markers, because they have a total movement. In fact, they can rush up to 8 inches. Remember, this is 24 inches, 8, 16, and then a simple advance will bring them to 19 inches. Well, one more charge brings them to 24 inches, but they don't have to get to 24 inches. They only need to get to 21 inches because of the next aspect of seizing territory that we should talk about. These two objectives have to be 9 inches apart. That means that they are the objective zones are only 3 inches apart. You see, we'll flip these over. You only need to be within 3 inches of the objective marker to contest for it, to seize it, or to deny it your enemy, which means from the edge of the marker, 3 inches out, there's 3 inches between them. Even the slowest units, even a dwarf unit that advances, can move from one objective marker, 4 inches, gets them close enough to the opposite marker, and they can still shoot. Remember, you can move and shoot in this game. That is significant because it means that you might not want to put all of the objective markers at the center of the table. One thing you probably want to do if you have a very slow army is clump these up as close as you possibly can, because you'll spend less time moving between them. The one time where you definitely want to put these markers as far away as possible is when you have that mounted army. I have a goblin wolf rider army that is incredibly fast, and by putting these at the widest extent of the table, remember the short edge of the table, we said there's only 24 inches between them, I can put these a full 6 feet away from each other. Those dwarves are going to have to choose which side of the table they want to focus on. They can contest for these, but if something goes wrong or right for them over on one side of the table, they're not going to be able to bring the rest of their forces over here. It is possible to practice divide and conquer. Now, again, none of these rules are universal. All it takes is one more marker over on this left-hand side of the table, and you can go all or nothing over here. The difficulty with that choice is, if you are going all or nothing on one side of the table, you've essentially turned this from a battle of, can I secure 3 objective markers, to a battle of, can my opponent take 1 from me? If you allow him to take 2 without being contested, or alternatively, if you have a situation where it's 2 and 2, and you allow him to take these 2 and you're not even going to fight for them, all he has to do is deny you 1, and he will win by 2-1. He doesn't even have to take it from you. He just has to contest for it on the 4th turn. And that's another thing that I seldom see discussed. Because the victory conditions are dependent, at least in the basic game, upon the table state at the end of the 4th turn, it is entirely possible to husband your resources if you have 1 objective marker that you have secured. Just wait. And then quickly get men to within 3 inches, or units to within 3 inches of all the others. And if they're all contested and you've got the only uncontested, you don't even have to fight. If your opponent has used all of his activations to fight and he's left you an opening, you can just go stand within 3 inches. Now it's contested. He loses control, and wouldn't you know it, you win the battle 1-0. There's no bonus points for securing a victory by 2, 3, or even 4 objective markers. The nice thing about placing objective markers is that you always want to go first. You always want to put the first marker down. First of all, it boxes out that 9-inch circle all the way around that objective marker. And that can be important when there's terrain on the board that you're looking to avoid. If our table has a forest and you're going up against wood elves, let's say, who have that strider ability, by placing an objective marker directly adjacent to, but not within, that terrain feature, now you have a 9-inch buffer where your opponent can't drop an objective marker inside the terrain, which would limit your ability to reach that marker. That's an important consideration. I suspect that most people believe that a nice even spread of neutrally placed objective markers is the way to go. I hope that what we've said so far has encouraged you to play around with some riskier behavior, particularly if you've got the stats and the special abilities to really make these unusual objective locations pay off. One of those abilities is the scout ability. Dwarf scouts are wonderful because, well, let's talk a little bit about what scout does first. These units may be set aside before deployment. After all other units finish, must be deployed, and may move by up to 12 inches. So even if you have fewer units than your opponent, you can force him to show his hand, commit all your forces, barring the existence of a scout, and then you get to pick which battle you want to fight. Let's move these way over here, because you may be thinking that a dwarf force that finds itself in a game situation like this, and again, this is the Platonic ideal, of course there will be terrain in between, but this dwarf force is not in as bad a shape as you might expect because it has a scout, and that scout gets to deploy up to 24 inches onto the table. They deploy last, and they get a 12-inch move before the game clock starts, which means they are already, even with their only 8 inches of movement, if these objective markers are within an inch or two, I think it's 1 inch is about as far away as they have to be within 1 inch of that border. So I think that's an important lesson. Drop these 2 inches away from the opposite deployment zone, or 2 inches from either deployment zone, because you don't know which one is yours. And then with your first advance, 8 inches puts you to within 3, and your scout is challenging already. That may be all you need to do. This scout may be able to act as a speed bump, which will slow the enemy's advance down in order to give you enough time to bring your real heavy hitters up. They are going to take, of course, 2 or 3 turns to close that distance. Alternatively, shooters are a wonderful way with that 24 inches of range. Just bring them up to a safe location and just start blasting away. This particular dwarf with his crossbow he's actually a ranger with scout, so he does not have strider. But this is another thing that I wanted to point out. You don't need to have strider when you have a scout because you ignore terrain on that 12 inches of movement. You've effectively negated half of the table's worth of terrain by the existence of that ranger ability. I'm sorry, I misspoke. Because of that scouting ability. I always confuse ranger and strider, probably because strider is one of those rangers. All right, so where were we? We were talking about how great scout is, because even a slow fella starts the game on his own half of the table. And with the 24-inch range, he's going to be able to seriously soften up your opponents, which buys time for his brothers to trundle along behind him. Since we have terrain on the brain, we might as well point out that clever placement of objective markers can box out a piece of terrain. My dwarves don't like terrain because they're slow. So when I place an objective marker, if I don't want an objective inside this piece of terrain, I just have to place a piece right next to it. No other objective can be placed within 9 inches. In a 1-to-1 scale, look at this. Even putting it this far away means there's no way to put an objective marker inside this terrain. I can bypass it completely. From a mobility perspective, I have negated the damage that this piece of terrain does to my Trundlebot buddies. Of course, the opposite holds true. If you have an army where everyone has the Strider ability, go ahead and drop. You absolutely want to drop objective markers inside terrain because your enemy is going to have to take 2 to 3 turns, which only to get through it, 1 to get to it. And that's something else that's probably a little out of the context of this video, but try to, if you are alternating placement of terrain, try to put those terrain pieces 6.5 inches away from your opponent's deployment zone. They can't move into the terrain. It becomes an effective charge stopper because you can't move more than 6 inches if you move through that terrain. Their whole first turn, that extra 6 inches of movement that their mounted guys, that their fast guys have, no longer applies. And that can really hurt a fast unit because remember, fast units don't just lose 6 inches of movement when you do this. They lose 10. They lose, if they want to charge, 6 is all they can move. Instead of moving their maximum movement of, well, what would that be? It would be 6, 12, but they can move an extra 4, 14. It actually costs them 10 inches of movement. They're not going to like it if you put an objective marker. Well, it would be the 6 inches plus another 3, 10 inches away from their deployment zone, but a full 2 moves. It's not going to be till turn 2 that you can even contest this. They're not going to like that. Now, when it comes to deployment, it becomes even more difficult to talk about effective strategies because your deployment depends so heavily on where these objective markers are placed. Generally speaking, you're going to want to deploy as close to these objective markers as possible. If you've got a group of 3 that are near and 2 that are far, take the 3. You can grab them and you can move off of those objective markers. And when you have a situation that an objective marker is behind a couple of others, in some cases, that objective marker can be defended by 2 other objective markers. An opponent that wants to take all 3 of these has to stop and wait for the end of the turn to secure this objective marker before moving on to one behind. Sometimes this can be an effective strategy. If you have a situation where you've got firm control over 2 of them and you've got a choke point where your opponent needs 2 turns, but it's turn 4, he doesn't have time to get to that last objective marker, you may go ahead and say, you know what, I'm not even going to bother defending these 2. I own number 2. Let's put some tokens down here. I own number 2, 3, and 5, and I don't need to fight for 4. Maybe I don't even control 1 and 5. Maybe I control these 2, and rather than fighting to contest number 4, I decide to move over and contest number 1. Because even if I give up this one at the end of the turn, my opponent is not going to be able to take that, and I can win 2-1. So there are times where and I mention this in this video because this is something else to consider. When you have a choke point, you may decide, of course they're 9 inches apart anyway, but you may decide that this is an effective strategy for the placement of these objective markers. I'll take this one, and if I can grab both of these, then one of them effectively defends the other because your opponent, by the end of the 4th turn, may not have enough resources to capture 2 objective markers at the same time. And being forced to choose limits his options. Man, there's a lot going on in this game. I didn't even really get to deployment yet. We talked a little bit about scouts. Scouts give you the whole half of the table to deploy in, and because it's deploy and then move, you don't have to worry about that 9-inch buffer. The only buffer you need to worry about is the standard can't move to within 1 inch. Is it within 1 inch? May only move within 1 inch when charging, and that scout move is not a charge. So that is something else to be aware of on deployment. If your scout deploys in an area in a gap where there's a 1 inch, if there's a 2-inch gap between terrain items and he's able to be the first scout to deploy, he's going to push the opponent's scout back an additional inch as well. So there's some more geometry to consider. That scout is going to have to decide whether he wants to deploy on the edge of a terrain item or not. Although terrain doesn't affect him, right, on that first scout move, but on turn 1, it might. Only being able to move 6 inches could be a big deal for him because of that blocking terrain. Or even not being able to move through the terrain at all because it is complete blocking, whether it's a building or one of the fiery pits of hell. A lot going on here, man. We didn't really talk about deployment a whole lot, but maybe that's a good one for the next video. And of course, we'll be doing some more full-on battles, but I just thought it was worthwhile to sit down and talk about some of these numbers and talk about some of these ways of thinking about where do we put our objective markers. This is the first real chess game, first real chance you have to do bluffs and counter bluffs and get in your opponent's head. Take full advantage of it. Spend a little more time thinking about this. That's all I got for you today. I'm praying for you.